All right, hi everyone. We're going to get started because we have a lot to cover today. My name is Molly Culton. I'm an organizer with Sierra Club California, and today we're going to talk about issues pertaining to water and supply in Southern California, focusing specifically on how a proposed single tunnel project in the San Francisco Bay Delta will affect ratepayer costs in Southern California. Brandon Dawson, who is our lead policy advocate on water issues, will be giving a detailed presentation on this subject. We want to make sure that this presentation is more of a conversation rather than a lecture. So if you have any questions, we'll take a pause every couple slides for questions. And if you have a question, you can use the chat box feature and we can unmute you so you can ask your question. Since we expect a lot of people to be on the webinar today, it might be easier just to use the chat box feature rather than raising your hand and having me unmute you. Before we begin, we're going to take a moment of silence to show solidarity and respect for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all the Black lives that have been lost to police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. So just take a moment of silence. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it off to Brandon.
Hi, everyone. This is Brandon Dawson, water policy advocate for Sierra Club California. And we are going to talk a bit about Southern California and some water needs down there. So first, we'll talk about Southern California. Because Southern California is a region, I'm pretty sure I don't need to geographically lay it out for you where I'm talking about, but we're going to talk about where the region gets its water from, how the water gets there, and then who supplies that water to residents once the water is there. And then we'll talk about the infamous single tunnel project that's being proposed by the state and why it's bad. And then we'll get into some alternatives to the tunnel that the state can employ that are both environmentally beneficial and less costly for California ratepayers. And then lastly, Molly will go into some detail about how you guys can get involved in our campaign. So this webinar is part 3 of a 3-part series that we've been holding on the single tunnel. The first part had to do with the Delta. The second part had to do with the Bay Area, and now we're on to Southern California because it's the third region that's implicated in the tunnel debate. But before that, we're going to talk about where the water comes from. So while much of the water in Southern California is used from local sources such as groundwater aquifers, around 50 to 60% of the water in Southern California is supplied by sources that aren't within the region, meaning that water is imported. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, which was the first piece of infrastructure to import water to the region beginning in 1913, transports water from Owens Valley, which is east of the Sierra Nevadas. And then you also have water coming from the Colorado River via the Colorado River Aqueduct, and that started in 1939. These two aqueducts provided a lot of the water necessary to support substantial growth in California in the early 20th century. But after World War II, California experienced another big boom in economic expansion and also population growth. And so they needed more water. And that was when the State Water Project was started to be thought of. And eventually in 1973, that State Water Project began transporting water south via a new water source, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. Diverting and pumping the water to Southern California and just generally is a lot of energy, and it depletes a lot of the rivers that flow into what naturally would have been those tributaries and those rivers from the fresh water that negatively impacts fish and wildlife that rely on the ecosystems in those rivers. Moreover, a lot of operation habits and the way that they're a lot of the way that a lot of the pumps are operated, that water, those pumps can actually change the flow of direction of the water, which then change the flow and direction of the fish species living there, meaning they then swim towards the pumps and eventually die, and that can lead to a lot of decline in fishery populations. So I mentioned that the State Water Project pumps water from the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. And just for some of you that don't know, and a refresher for some of you that have been on our other webinars or just well versed in California water policy, um, the Delta is a region that is one component of the San Francisco Bay Delta, which is the largest natural estuary on the Pacific coast of both North and South America. So it's pretty big. Geographically, the Delta region is located at the western edge of the Northern Central Valley, and it's about 60 miles east of San Francisco, with Stockton being the largest city in the region. It's called a delta because it's located at the convergence of two major river systems, California's two largest river systems, actually, the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River. And it's fed by snow melt from the Sierra and Cascade mountain ranges. What happens is, and you can see kind of how this plays out in the picture on the left. Snow melts and then runs into the smaller tributaries, such as the American River, the Feather River, or the Tuolumne River. And then it eventually ends up in the south-flowing Sacramento River and the north-flowing San Joaquin River. And that water then flows accordingly westward, ending up in the delta and eventually emptying out into the bay, San Francisco Bay. Because the delta is the Central Valley's lowest elevation point, it's one of the easiest places to export northern water from Northern California to Southern California. So it's the center of two major and massive elaborate water systems, the Federal Central Valley Project, as well as the State Water Project, which I mentioned earlier. When water's pumped from the delta, and it's either shipped south or stored for Southern California, and that's about 50% of the water that is pumped, and then the other 50% of the water ends up in areas on the coast or in the hands of, in the pockets really, of farmers in the Southern Central Valley. Just to give you an idea of how much water is pumped from the delta a year through those two systems, the both systems pump nearly a combined 5 million acre feet of water from the delta alone, and in the highest years that can be between 6.5 and 7 million acre feet. And just to give you a reference of how much water an acre foot is, 1 acre foot is enough water to cover a football field 1 foot deep, and it's also enough to meet the water needs of two families of four for 1 year. So it's pumping a lot of water and either storing that water or shipping that water south that would have just naturally flowed through the delta and out to the bay.
All right, this is our first pause for questions in the presentation. If you have a question at this time, feel free to use the chat box feature and type your question into the chat box, or you can use the raise hand feature and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. I do not see any questions so far in the questions panel. Oh, it looks like one might have just came in. Okay, let me click on this. All right, so the delta itself is a re-engineering of the normal spring flows, I'm guessing spring flows and summer drought. What is the value of ag products in the delta versus the Central Valley?
That's a good question. So because the delta is already a region in which water would have naturally flowed, I think the value is one. Obviously, agriculture has a major economic value for California. As much stuff that I give agriculture and their water use, like I understand why they're necessary economic industry. They provide food sources, obviously, and Sierra Club isn't against agriculture by any means, but we do think they use a lot of water that's unnecessary. Um, the value of northern delta agriculture or northern agriculture in the delta is that it's already located there, so a lot of that water doesn't need to be shipped or pumped or anything. And then you also have a lot of cleaner groundwater aquifers in that region, whereas in the southern Central Valley, in southern San Joaquin Valley, and some on the western edge of the Central Valley as well, southern western edge, a lot of that land is not land that was made, or not land that is not easily used to or was originally meant to have agricultural use. And by that I mean you find a lot of the land in the southern Central Valley basically the soil is really bad and it requires a lot of water to even grow anything. And then you also have a lot of farmers who grow crops that, like pistachios and almonds, um, in crops that require a lot of water and are requiring a lot of energy to be shipped to have that water shipped to them as well. So the value is of northern delta agriculture is that it's located in a semi okay region where water doesn't necessarily have to travel as much, and it also provides an economic benefit.
All right. And then another question from Paul. He asked, what percent of NorCal's Delta water is shipped out?
Um, Total, I believe, close to 60%. And that can be as high as 70 and 80% in some years, depending on depending on the type of year it's in. So like if it's a wet year, meaning a lot of water, I mean a lot of rain that year, and so there's a lot of water running out, you can have a lot of water being shipped out. But if it's just a regular normal year, I think it's between 60 and 70%. I'd have to follow up with you on that just to be sure, but I'd be happy to do that. And then it's dry years, it's even more water due to the fact that, which is really bizarre considering that there's less water flowing. And so, yeah,
And then
sorry.
we have another comment from someone who's having difficulty seeing the video. I'm wondering if anyone else is having that issue or if you can see the slides. Rebecca, you might want to try logging off and then logging back on and see if the video comes up. Thank you, Elizabeth, for letting us know that you can see and it's okay. And then another question from Paul. I've been told that 10% of energy in California is used to move water. Can you comment or confirm?
Um, I can't confirm that right now, but I know it's a large portion of California's water. I mean, sorry, California's energy use. And by large, I mean not necessarily a majority or plurality even, but I think it's more than 10%. I'd have to check on that, but I want to say that I want to confidently say that I've seen it's more than 10%. Happy to touch with you on offline about that
Yeah.
as well.
And for the questions that we don't have answers to immediately, there will be follow-up after this presentation, and you'll have both Brandon and my contact information, so we can follow up after the presentation as well. All right, we're going to move on because we have a lot to cover. So let's do the next slide.
So after the water is pumped from the delta, I mean, it's obviously pumped from Owens Valley and then also the Colorado River as well, but we're specifically talking about the delta in this presentation. After the water is pumped from the delta, it's transported hundreds of miles via the State Water Project and then the Department of Water Resources, which is the state agency that operates the State Water Project. It sells that water to either cities or counties or water agencies slash wholesalers. Some shown on the slide here. There's symbols, and that they then supply water directly to farms and residents. In Southern California, many cities and water districts are member agencies of a mega water district, the powerful Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. So we'll take a few slides just to talk about the MWD. That's what we call it for short. And MWD is a regional wholesaler that provides water to 26 member public agencies who then deliver either directly or through sub-agencies that water to nearly 19 million residents in Southern California, and that's in 6 counties. Los Angeles County, Orange County, Riverside County, San Bernardino County, San Diego County, and Ventura County. MWD's service area encompasses 5,200 square miles, which is roughly the size of Connecticut and Puerto Rico alone. And it's larger than the combined square mileage of both Delaware and Rhode Island. So suffice to say, Metropolitan Water District is the largest water supplier in California, both Northern and Southern California. This slide shows the member agencies of Metropolitan Water District, all 26 of them. And MWD is governed by a board of 36 individuals who are either elected or appointed officials from those member agencies. And so, for example, the mayor of Los Angeles appoints 5 people to represent Los Angeles as on the Met board, whereas some water districts may appoint some of their board members to be representatives of them on the Met board. For the cities listed above, each of these has its own water distributor, right? So Los Angeles, again, is that entity is the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or LADWP. And in Long Beach, that entity's Long Beach Water Department. So those are the water suppliers that get water from that and then give that distribute that water to or retail that water to residents. Each of the water agencies shown listed serve different areas, cities, and unincorporated communities, and other smaller water agencies. So, for example, the San Diego County Water Authority serves the city of San Diego, as well as other smaller water agencies, such as the Otay Water District and the Rainbow Municipal Water District. So there's a lot of layers to how the water is actually supplied and gets to the taps of residents first from when it's first pumped from the Delta. MWD is run by a general manager, currently Jeff Kreitlinger, who's set to retire later this year. And due to the size and the number of people served by MWD, as well as the entities served by MWD, meaning the cities and the agencies, MWD is highly influential in state and regional water policy, and we'll often find a lot of their lobbyists up here in Sacramento working in the Capitol alongside Sierra Club and other NGOs as well. And by working along, I mean usually on the other side of, but we see them in the Capitol pretty often. So I mentioned that MWD is pretty powerful, and they have a lot of authority. And one of those authorities is setting water rates. And MWD does this every other year during a biennial budget review process. For Southern California residents that receive water from MWD, the water bill you actually see reflects a wide range of costs from a number of different sources and agencies. So the bill includes charges from costs incurred by water service providers at both the local, retail, and regional levels. So if you're, for example, if you're in the Otay Water District, you'll see costs that have been accumulated from both the Otay Water District, the San Diego County Water Authority, and then also MWD. And for many, some of the water agencies also extend beyond charging customers beyond their monthly water bills. And you'll see some water taxes that are then popping up on property tax bills as well. The cost of new projects, such as new infrastructure projects that provide water to residents, or new treatment facilities that then clean up polluted water and provide that water to residents, is always pushed down on ratepayers and residents. It might be offset by a grant in some cases, but usually it's pushed down to the ratepayers and residents that receive the water from that agency. And it's common for MWD and I'm sure other agencies to market this cost as like the cost of a latte, meaning it's going to be like a $6 increase on your water bill or something. But because the price of water gets so compounded over time, and then you also have inflation, that $6 rate hike can quickly become $24 or more, depending on how the cost is pushed down through those different levels. And that's a very in the weeds convoluted process that I would be happy to talk to people offline if they have a lot of questions about. But I just wanted to give you kind of a primer about how water rates are set within MWD's area, and what you actually see on your water bill if you get water from MWD is it's a compilation of different prices and different costs and funds. But since 2003, MWD's prices have actually more than doubled. And just in April 2020, MWD approved a 3% rate hike for the 2020-21 year, and then a 4% rate hike for the 21-22 year. And after a short Q&A next, we'll talk kind of where about some of that money that rate hike is going to be going towards.
All right, we're going to take another break here for questions. So if you have questions, you can type them right on into the chat box, or raise your hand and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. Okay, so we have a comment from Charming. Electricity is used to pump water is 30% and statewide. So, yeah. Thank you for that, Charming.
Thanks, Charming.
I'm not seeing any new questions yet. Oh, it looks like we just got one from Paul. Who pays more for water, Northern California residents or Southern California?
That's a good question, Paul. I quite frankly don't know the answer for that. Don't want to give you any wrong information, so I'm not going to make a determination, but just based off logic and how I think things typically flow, probably Southern California, I think, just because a lot of the Southern California region has to get their water shipped and imported in, which is very expensive, obviously. So I would assume them, whereas some Northern California has water sources that are way more local and don't require as much transport. But again, I don't want to say that that is certain. It just makes sense to me. But a lot
Yeah.
of things that make sense aren't necessarily how things actually work, and I recognize that. So sorry.
And yeah, we'll follow up with you on that, Paul, and confirm it because that is a really good question to have some concrete numbers. Okay, Jeff has a question. Are the prices for water from the state water project different for agricultural, such as Westlands versus municipal MWD?
um, Good question. Yeah, they could be. I don't know about the state water project specifically, but I do know that on the Central Valley project side, and the Central Valley project is one of the water supply systems that pumps water from the Delta, and it actually primarily provides water. 70% of that water that's pumped from the Delta through the Central Valley project goes to agriculture itself, and that water is highly subsidized because it's so it's super cheap for farmers, and that's because it's subsidized by the feds and state taxpayers generally. So it's cheaper for farmers who get water on the Central Valley project side, than it is for the state water project side. But I don't know what the cost difference is between Met versus ag on the state water project side.
And Charming entered a clarifying comment. SoCal pays more than Northern California, with San Diego paying the highest
Yep,
in
that makes sense.
rates.
Charming is a
Okay.
lifesaver.
And then we have a question from Michael. When LADWP raises water rates, who is deciding they have the authority to do that?
When LADWP raises water rates, I would assume, and Charming, please feel free to jump in because you're much more well versed in LA's water policy and things than I am. But going off the cuff, I would think that the commissioners of the LADWP are having authority to do that, considering that they are the governing board of LADWP. Um, Once again, Charming, if you have any thoughts on that, please let me know.
Yeah, and Paul, I see your other question. I think I'm going to save that one for the end of the presentation as we cover the rest of the slides, because I think that would be a good topic to cover at the end. Charming says they have a ratepayer and the city council approves. Okay,
Perfect. Thank you.
so we're going to continue on. And once again, there will be an opportunity to ask more questions and submit comments at the end of the presentation as well.
Cool. Thank you. And just for transparency's sake, obviously, I am not stationed in Southern California, and I've actually only been with Sierra Club California for about a year and a half, or a little over a year and a half. So I'm still learning a lot about California water, and I rely a lot on volunteers and members of Sierra Club in Southern California, such as Charming, for a lot of that education. And so, if you have any questions in the region that I can answer, please feel free to reach out to the Angeles chapter or San Diego chapters. Water committees or just their staff as well. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions that can't be answered for you right here, and I apologize for that. But we're going to move to an immediate threat that kind of, I put immediate threat to the Bay, but it's a threat really to the Delta, the Bay, and also Southern California ratepayers, and that's the single tunnel project, also known as the Delta Conveyance Project. Before the Q&A, I mentioned that Metropolitan Water District recently approved a rate hike for the next 2 years, and a portion of this rate hike will cover an annual distribution of $25 million per year, so $50 million total, for the planning of a Delta Conveyance project, which is also known as the Single Tunnel Project. And this has been a project that's been in decades in the making, or in the works and proposals. Central Valley farmers and water wholesalers or agencies such as Met have pressed for increasingly more water to be diverted from the Delta and either stored or sent south via a large canal or tunnel. The first instance of this was the Peripheral Canal, which was first proposed in the 1940s. And in the 1970s, during his early terms as governor, Jerry Brown supported that proposal. And because it was state taxpayer funded, it had to go on the ballot. Unfortunately, it was resoundingly rejected by statewide voters, in that ballot in 1982. In 2013, so during Jerry Brown's second half, I guess, as governors, um, a similar proposal was released under the name of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which was a plan consisting of restoring ecosystem habitat for the Delta, but also improving water conveyance facilities in the Delta area. And the conveyance portion of that project, which proposed constructing two massive tunnels to divert Sacramento River water underneath the Delta and then deliver that water to Southern California and the Central Valley, as well as, like I said, storing it for those entities as well. In 2015, that conveyance portion, so the twin tunnels, was renamed California Water Fix, which is what a lot of people now know it as. But due to a lot of opposition from Sierra Club, other conservation groups, and as well as ratepayers in Southern California, by the time Jerry Brown left office, he was only considering building a single tunnel to do the work that the twin tunnels would have done, as well as the peripheral canal. So that brings us to current day, which means now enters Governor Newsom's single tunnel project. So, in his first State of the State address in February of 2019, Governor Newsom announced his support for a single tunnel in place of the twin tunnels. And accordingly, the Department of Water Resources withdrew their proposals for water fix a couple months later in May 2019. So, in January 2020, the Department of Water Resources released a notice of preparation, which initiates the environmental review process for the project. And it is the first step in this CEQA process as well. According to that notice of preparation, and also discussions and talks that have been had at the Delta Construction and Design Conveyance Authority, which is a joint powers authority commissioned to oversee the construction and design of the single tunnel project, the state wants to build a 40-mile tunnel that would be 190 feet below the surface in the North Delta. And like its predecessors, it would be operated in a way to divert water before it hits the Delta. And that water would be freshwater flows that otherwise would have flowed through the Delta and out to the bay. The water would be either stored for or shipped to Southern Californian farmers in Central Valley. And the tunnel would have a capacity to divert up to 6,000 cubic feet per second of water. So that's the equivalent of nearly 45,000 gallons of water per second that would be exported when the tunnel is operated. Illustrated by the chart on the right, Department of Water Resources has identified two potential corridors for the tunnel, a central corridor highlighted in the yellow, and then a eastern corridor, which is highlighted in the purple. And both of those corridors have major environmental and public health impacts for the Delta, and as well as Delta communities that live in the region. And lastly, the project's estimated to cost nearly $11 billion, but that's before inflation, and that's also before cost overruns. So who knows exactly how much the tunnel could potentially end up costing, and we'll talk about why that's a problem next. So the title of this webinar is Why the Tunnel is Bad for Southern California Residents, and it's not a solution for Southern California's water problems. And there's four reasons why that Sierra Club highlights. And the first is that contrary to what the state and Metropolitan Water District say, the tunnel isn't necessarily going to ensure reliability or certainty for Southern California water, Southern California residents. Even if the tunnel is built, it would address earthquake vulnerabilities in existing infrastructure. So any water that's exported through the single tunnel would eventually have to flow to and through existing infrastructure, which is distribution systems in the Southern San Joaquin Valley, as well as Southern California regions owned or operated by either local entities, the state, or local water agencies. And much of this infrastructure is actually at greater risk of earthquake damage than many of the Delta levees that Metropolitan Water District and the state say are at risk of seismic failure due to and could eventually harm some water resources. And that infrastructure is more at risk because it's either located geographically located above a more at-risk fault, or it just has negligent maintenance and upkeep. So even if the water were supposed to be exported through the tunnel, it wouldn't necessarily still get to Southern California or where it's supposed to be stored because it could still be lost in that infrastructure. Second, the tunnel doesn't provide any new water source for Southern Californians because it doesn't provide water from a new plentiful source, right? So the source of water will still be the Delta, which is a system that's in decline. And we know because of climate change impacts and federal rules that actually increase diversions, meaning the Central Valley Project can now export more water through the Delta than the State Water Project can. Um, Less and less water will be flowing through the Delta, which means there won't be that much water, if any, that would be allowed to flow through the tunnel. So the tunnel will just be taking, and any water that it is there, it'll just be taking more water out of an already starving ecosystem, which we'll touch on in another slide. Third, the tunnel doesn't provide certainty. Like I said, it doesn't provide any new water, but what it does do is it increases your water costs for Southern California ratepayers. So the project again is estimated to cost $11 million, and that's before inflation. And all of that would fall to the 19 million ratepayers that MWD provides water to. That's because MWD is a primary funder at picking up the cost of the tunnel. So you're seeing more costs on your water bill, and you're seeing, and also your property taxes, and you're not seeing any additional water or new water source, which makes my next point even more interesting. With more and more Southern California cities recognizing that importing water is pretty expensive, and also that Metropolitan Water District has increased costs a lot over time, they're falling back on promoting more water recycling and conservation programs within their local jurisdictions. So you'll see, and I'll touch on this a bit more later, but for example, Los Angeles and Santa Monica both already had pledges to get to meet certain recycling thresholds by 2035 or even sooner. So with that in mind, knowing that you have local taxes going towards those projects, it would seem silly that you would then have to be paying more on your water bill for this project that doesn't provide you any new water and doesn't give you any certainty that any water would actually get to you. So the tunnel is bad for Southern California residents, but it's also especially bad for the Delta, both residents and the ecosystem. And as Sierra Club, we're highly invested in promoting sustainable ecosystems, especially in areas that are already at harm and threatened. And so I just want to touch on some of the reasons why it's bad for the Delta, which is an already threatened ecosystem. First, it's inconsistent with state law and policy. The Delta Reform Act of 2009 requires that projects in the Delta meet co-equal goals of providing Californians with a more reliable water source or supply, and also protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem, which is where a lot of the water comes from for all Californians. The Act also established a policy of making sure that local jurisdictions reduce their reliance on Delta water. So it seems highly inapposite to that for the state to construct a massive 40-mile tunnel that would be drilled 190 feet below the Delta and then divert millions of acre feet of water through that tunnel, that would only harm the Delta ecosystem, which is already pretty worse off. So the tunnel is just inconsistent with that altogether. And then it also affects Delta water quality conditions, and you'll see deteriorations if the tunnel is built. And that's because if it's built, then the amount of fresh water that flows through the Delta will be reduced, and runoff from all the fields and the farms that are further south and flow through will gather in the Delta, and they'll combine with toxins from other areas, including the Port of Stockton, and eventually render the water poisonous for the local resources that need that water and depend on that water and the fresh water to come flush out all of those toxins. Moreover, that toxic water, and you've already confined to this in a lot of Delta waterways, that toxic water facilitates the growth of harmful algal blooms, which occur when cyanobacteria accumulates and produces toxins that have pretty severe impacts. Those toxins can be fish dying. I mean, those impacts can be fish dying off at favorite fishing spots, to pets that drink water being poisoned, to children sustaining blisters and rashes from just swimming in an affected river that has some of these harmful algal blooms. And you'll see on that slide a caution sign in some Delta waterways that is pretty prominent due to the harmful algal blooms. Third, the tunnel, and I touched on this a little bit before, it hastens the collapse of the Delta ecosystem. It exports more fresh water out of the ecosystem, which then is affecting the fish species and the wildlife species that depend on those ecosystems. Moreover, and I touched on this earlier, pump operation for the tunnel and also just currently Pump operations reverse the natural flow of delta waters that interfere with migrations of fish, and so you see a lot of fish dying. And that dying fish species can then in turn affect bird species and other wildlife species that depend on that food, as well as some salmon species that would have eventually spawned out into the bay and provided a food source for mammals such as orcas and killer whales that are in the ocean. And lastly, the tunnel's bad because construction will uh, greatly impact the quality of life for Delta residents. The tunnel is estimated to take 16 years to build, and that's 16 years of increased air quality issues resulting from increased traffic due to construction trucks and equipment that are bringing in all these equipment, and also all these toxins because obviously trucks have toxins, especially diesel trucks. And then you also have a lot of that excavated muck being stored, which hardens and when it's hot, and then it becomes windy, and all of that muck kind of spreads throughout the Delta region, and it's breathed in by the residents. And then you also have amplified noise pollution due to pile drivers. So this greatly impacts the communities in the Delta, and a lot of that is air quality issues. And I just want to point out that the Delta region is already an area that fails to meet healthy air quality standards that have been set by the American Lung Association. So you're only worsening the air quality for an already bad area that has pretty bad EJ issues. Some of our allies at Restore the Delta have done a really good job at promoting or elevating that issue up as well. So all this is to say the state can and needs to direct resources from the tunnel and promote water projects that are sustainable, less costly, and also regional. Um, Enhancing local water projects that are efficient, environmentally beneficial, and reduce the need of long distance water transfers uh, will be super beneficial to all Californians because it'll decrease your water bills, and it also will allow for the ecosystems that need the water to get the water that's necessary to have those ecosystems thrive. Moreover, providing these types of projects, regionally resilient projects, uh, is in line with Delta Reform Act, and it's in line with a lot of the conservation efforts that not only Sierra Club has been promoting, but also the state says it wants to promote as well. So on this slide, you'll see a myriad of examples that Sierra Club has proposed over the years, and I'll just touch on a few for a quick second. So one of them is investing in groundwater recharge and conservation projects that remediate contaminated aquifers. A lot of California's water supply, as many of you know, is underground in like underground lakes called aquifers, obviously, and those aquifers can, especially in Southern California, can become polluted due to just different reasons. And so, if you allow for more water to be filtered through that area and flush out all those pollutants, then you have a water supply that's now open up and available, and it's also less costly to treat that water um, because there's not and and more energy efficient as well to treat the water. Um, Another thing, and I touched on this earlier, is investing in water recycling projects that ensure a sustainable drought-proof supply. So I mentioned that Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and San Diego already have pledges to meet certain recycling water thresholds by a year certain. For example, LA's is 100% by 2035, I believe, and Santa Monica's is, I forgot. I want to say 2035 is like 50%. Sorry if that's incorrect. But you have these regions that are investing in water recycling facilities that offer a significant amount of untapped water supply that could then be used for local water projects and a local water source. And then lastly, you could promote stormwater capture. Well, so that's third. But you could also incentivize low water use and urban landscaping methods that are more environmentally beneficial. Promoting the use of soil moisture systems that are timed and efficient has been proven as a efficient measure to conserve water, and it's also less costly as well. So local agencies, having the state give more money to local governments to give out these grants and give out these and subsidizing the cost of a lot of these projects will prove to be highly beneficial for all Californians. And examples like these and more can be found on in Sierra Club California's white paper titled Smart Alternatives to the Tunnel, which was authored by members of our water committee, such as Charming. And you can also find that document on our website, sierraclub.org/California/water.
All right, so if you're looking at ways you can get involved, you can sign up to become one of our water activists at the following link, www.sierraclub.org/California/volunteer. Not, and also tell your friends and family and friends and family members and neighbors about what you learned today and invite them to come and be involved in the campaign. And for more information about the Defend the Delta campaign, you can go to our Sierra Club water page at www.sierraclub.org/California/water. A recording of this webinar and our other webinars are also available at that link as well. So with that, we'll do the final round of questions. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. We have until 3 o'clock. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat box feature or use the raise hand feature. I can unmute you. Looks like we got quite a bit in the question box. Right.
Cool.
Michael has a comment. It's a longer comment, but he says the Tuolumne River has been diverted and dammed since the early and mid 20th century. Most of these diversions reduce flow to the delta. Nearly all of them on the Tuolumne and Mokelumne. Another flow diverted goes to the Bay Area and Northern California water users. We in NorCal divert water and have a long history of doing so. Do you see the inconsistency in the club's position?
No, because we're not saying only Southern California um, needs to not import water, and our position is also not that no water should be imported or exported from the Delta at all. Like, we are realistic in that the way California's population is set, and also just the geographic locations of where things are in California. Um, Water will need to be exported and imported. That's just the way of life. Our our solution, however, is due to the fact that the delta is dying, and has been in decline for years. Uh, Southern California and also other areas such as the Bay Area, so Santa Clara Valley Water District, as well as San Francisco Public Utility Commission, they need to do more to get off Delta water, and also the Tuolumne, for example. So I think our position is pretty consistent across the board with um, how we promote our water conservation and water recycling philosophy. And if you don't agree, I would be happy to talk with you offline about that as well.
All right, and kind of have a follow-up comment relating to that from Desmond. Would it be more cost-effective for Southern California to build local desalination plants rather than divert water from the Sacramento Delta? Does Sierra Club support the idea of desalination plants?
Yeah, and I'm saying yes to. I just started the sentence with that. So Sierra Club, in the white paper, we also talk about desal as well. Um, Sierra Club we're pretty supportive of brackish water desalination, and so that's inland located and water that's salty but also fresh and not nearly as saline as ocean water, obviously. And we support that because it's less energy intensive and also because it can be transferred pretty easily. Um, Ocean desal is an issue because it's high energy intensive, but also that brine has to go somewhere, and that brine is often like left back goes back into the ocean or the surrounding ecosystem, and that has become an issue with the club more recently. And I'm sure there are other Sierra Club members such as Charmaine who could touch on that a little bit more. But desal is mentioned as an option that we are open to exploring in our white paper as well, and that we've actually promoted in just our advocacy for better water projects.
Specifically, brackish water
Yeah,
desalination.
yeah, brackish water, yes.
Okay, so Judith asks, why do you think Governor Newsom is promoting the single tunnel solution?
Um, Frankly speaking, I mentioned MWD is very powerful. So is the state water contractors. Molly, can you go to the slide where I say who supplies the water, please?
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
will. Yep.
So this slide, not Kern County Water Agency, but those two entities, Westlands Water District and then State Water Contractors and then Metropolitan Water District, um, they have deep pockets, right? And so they are able, as well as farmers, just generally, they are able to influence the people they need to influence with money. Um, Sierra Club and other conservation organizations don't have nearly as deep of pockets, and so that could be one of the reasons why. And it could be a philosophical difference in terms of Newsom really does think that this project is necessary, and that's just a matter of the public needing to educate him on that and why we believe it's not necessary. Um, I just think that's really, quite frankly speaking, why you have these very powerful entities that want it and are promoting it, and they have the political pressure to do that. Sierra Club has for years been pushing back on that, and we've succeeded in it not being built so far. But time and time again, it comes up, and we're still doing the same thing. And it's with people like you who are on this webinar who are taking the time to actually learn about this issue, and then calling your local water agency and telling them to not support it if they do already, or and being more involved. If you take the time to do that, then eventually that puts the political pressure necessary on elected officials to push back on this project.
Right, and I think we need clarification. Question from Jeff. Why would there be less fresh water in the Delta if you indicated earlier that the tunnel project would not increase the amount of water available to Southern California?
Because so that water is it's either stored or it actually won't get to you all is what I was saying. So their whole argument for why the tunnel is needed is because it provides reliability, meaning that if there were an earthquake to happen in that region, then this tunnel would provide a way to get water shipped down to Southern California. And then they're also saying climate change impacts. But earthquake vulnerabilities exist in all of the other infrastructure that's already south of the delta. So any water that would have flowed through that tunnel doesn't isn't it's not certain it would get to Southern California, or stored in the places it needs to be stored. And then also it provides less water, fresh water to the delta because it's exporting water that would have flowed naturally through the delta. So it's kind of like where is that water going? Is really a question that um, needs to be reconciled with the state, right? So they're going to ship water that is not really plentiful already because of climate change, like I said. They're shipping that water somewhere, but it's not guaranteed that that water is going to get there.
Yep. And let's see, question from Gladwin. Hi, Gladwin. Glad you're on here today. Measure W in LA raised money for stormwater, groundwater, recycling, and water resilience. Should other communities work on similar measures?
Yes, I'm not familiar with Measure W, but I mean, other communities definitely should work on measures that. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the last half of that question?
Should other communities work on similar measures? Measure W raised money for
Yeah.
stormwater, groundwater, and recycling and water
Sorry.
resilience.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, if you're in a community that recognizes the need to kind of get away from imported water, and also that California climate change is impacting the way California manages water, and also has as much water impacts how much water is available for Californians to use, then I highly recommend that you work with your local elected officials to promote those types of measures. I think that that could be beneficial to not only your local community, but it also is beneficial to the Delta ecosystem, the fish and wildlife, and also the residents that live there, because um, you're not facilitating the decline of an ecosystem that they depend on.
And we have two good clarifying comments in the chat box from Charming, who is our wonderful LA water volunteer. Measure W only raises money for stormwater capture. And Kathleen, she has a comment that says the tunnel would siphon off the best quality fresh water from the Sacramento River. So If there are any more questions, I'll leave it open. This has been great. Y'all have had really great discussion and questions on this webinar, and I love seeing the engagement on here. So I see that Kathleen, you have your hand raised. Was that just for your questions or comments? Did you want me to unmute you? Okay. If anyone has any more questions or comments, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, if something comes to you, we will be following up with some additional materials and resources and links for you to take a look at as well. Okay, well, not seeing any other questions on the webinar.
Again, if like Molly said, if we didn't answer any of your questions, please feel free to reach out to both Molly and myself. Our names are our emails, molly.colton@sierraclub.org and then brandon.dawson@sierraclub.org. You can also find our contact info on our website. Want to thank Charming, Evelyn, who's been great and one of our lead volunteers on water for the state, for helping me do this webinar. And by do, I mean put it together, but also answering questions that I didn't have answers to. Last thing that I would ask is if you're in Southern California, specifically Metropolitan Water District's service area, get involved in advocacy before them. And you can do that a number of ways that I'd be happy to talk to you about offline.
Oh, we got a question from Marie. Yes. Could you speak to the amount of energy needed for reclamation of wastewater?
I couldn't, unfortunately. And it's sorry, that's a funny question because I was just thinking about that earlier today, because our energy person asked me about it, and we were talking about how we really never intersect except when it comes to reclamation of water, wastewater. I couldn't answer that question, but I want to know more about that. So send me an email, please, and we can have a discussion because I need to teach myself more about it.
Yeah, and that's reminding me, Brandon, of an earlier question that Paul had asked regarding reclamation. What is the future of water reclamation in Southern California and in Northern California?
I'm not sure. Charming, do you have an opinion on that? Sorry.
Charming, if your mic's working, Charming, I can unmute you, or you can
If you're,
just
yeah,
use the chat box.
I know at least in, I know that there are some reclamation, some really, really high advanced reclamation facilities located in both Southern and Northern California. I don't know how not popular. I don't know how prominent that idea is becoming, honestly, but I do know that they exist and they are really adding a lot to the conversation about what it means to reclaim wastewater and also reuse that water as well. I toured one in the Bay Area, the Santa Clara Valley Water District's advanced purification site, and that was very interesting. Very interesting. So,
Charming, you're unmuted. Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
I was waiting for Brandon to finish. So we are actually at a really great place with recycled water and the options available. And really the state actually has to catch up. Legislation has to catch up. So we are at this point where the science is in and the tests have been done to make recycled water directly potable, meaning once it's treated for it to get back into your faucet. And currently all over Southern California, recycled water is already being used because once it is treated, they actually put it back into the aquifer and they pump it back out to you, treat it again, and it goes into your faucet. So it's actually already widely used. If it's not being put back into the aquifer and into your faucet, it's being distributed to golf courses and cemeteries and other places that use that water for their lawns and their landscaping purposes. But really, this is something that's not something else you can really write a representative about so that they can get legislation passed so that becomes doable. And again, this is something that would reduce reliance on the Delta as well and prevent A lot of the water, which once it's treated, it just goes back into the ocean. We only use about 30% of it, of the water that is treated, and it's treated to a highly drinkable level, and it is just thrown back into the ocean.
Yeah. And that actually reminds me, sorry, I didn't add to this before. When Charmaine was talking about kind of like the state policy needs to get up to date on that, there was a bill a couple of years ago that kind of wanted the water board to have a recommendation to use direct potable reuse of water. And the water board, I believe, last year came out with a report on that, or is coming out with one or soon. And then after they do that, then like Charming said, this legislature will need to take that recommendation and put it into legislation, so the water board has authority to do that, or to mandate the necessary regulations to do that. And so I know that in some conversations I've had at the water board that's come up a couple of times, but in the state legislature itself, hasn't really come up that much.
All right, we only have a couple more minutes. Michael, I see your question. I think it might be best for y'all to follow up online and have a discussion about that, because you've raised some really good questions, and I think it would be better to have a conversation about those things offline. So thank you, everyone, for your engagement and your interest in today's webinar. Like I said, a recording will be available on our water page, which you'll receive the link for in a follow-up email. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.